Hey, welcome to On the Same Page, our first ever episode from here in Northwest Arkansas. We're in Fayetteville at a brand new bookstore called Nightbird Books, and this is the book we're looking at today, The Apple That Astonished Paris, a book of poems written by Billy Collins. Billy Collins now is the former poet laureate of the United States, and he's a poet who's accomplished something quite remarkable. He has written books that get great critical acclaim, and also he has a huge audience. He sells a lot of books. This is his first book of collected poems, and it had its origins right here in Fayetteville, Arkansas. We'll talk to Billy Collins, find out all about that and much more, plus talk to a panel of our readers, a few of whom are writers as well, about The Apple That Astonished Paris, today on the Same Page. Well, Billy Collins is here at Fayetteville at the University of Arkansas to give a poetry reading as part of the Winthrop Rockefeller Distinguished Lecture Series, and also in celebration of the 25 years of the University of Arkansas Press, which is the connection between your first published book of poems and our state of Arkansas. Would you explain how that came about?
Well, it was back in 1986. I was in my 40s. I hope you don't do the math too quickly on this, but I really hadn't had a serious book of poems out, and I submitted poems to the University of Arkansas Press on the recommendation of a friend of mine. And to make a long story short, Miller Williams, who was then the director and still lives here and with whom I had lunch today, took the poems, and that became this book called The Apple That Astonished Paris.
And you had submitted poems, I assume, to other publishing outfits.
Oh yes, I'd been slapped around and ignored and rejected, and we really need to find better words than acceptance and rejection. They're so fraught with psychological weight. But yes, he accepted the book, and the book has been in print for 17 years, which is an interesting indoor record for me. And so we're celebrating that, and we're celebrating the 25th anniversary of the press itself with this new edition of the book.
I understand it sort of shocked you when you found out from the point of your acceptance to the point at which the book would actually be published.
Well, yeah, I wanted it to be published the next day, or find it in the mail when I got home. But yeah, there was about a year and a half wait. But Miller Williams, in his sage, knowledgeable mode, said that he said, "Billy, that time is going to pass anyway, and this way you have a book waiting for you at the end of it, whereas you didn't, a day ago." So that made a lot of sense. Yeah.
You were in your 40s then. We haven't done the math too extensively, but you were in your 40s. And how long had you been writing poetry up to that point?
Oh, since I was in my single digits. I mean, since I was a child, really, and then morbidly as a teenager.
What do you mean morbidly?
Well, I wrote very desperate adolescent poems about the fact that I was, desperately misunderstood and heartbroken by some unworthy ninth grade girl, which was. I wrote these poems with a lot of images of daggers and bleeding hearts
and
and
margins, and
sort of like tattoo parlor imagery. But I think you have to write you have to write. If there's good writing in you, you get to it through bad writing. I think at least in my case, I had an inordinate amount of bad writing in me, which is why it took me so long to get to the good writing. But I think it's kind of a matter of excavation or exorcism, where you must get this bad stuff out and make all the mistakes and get all the cliches out of yourself, and then maybe you have something. In some cases, maybe you don't. You just have it's just bad stuff right to the bottom.
But you were always compelled to write. You never stopped writing. Or did you?
No,
stop?
I was always compelled. I never really stopped. I was going to give up at some point. I think a few years before the University of Arkansas Press accepted this manuscript. For a while there, I was getting published in tiny fly-by-night magazines with strange names, and the satisfaction of seeing my name in print in these little magazines had worn pretty thin, and I didn't have a book. I was in my 40s, sort of a sad. I mean, I was in pathetic condition at that time, and I did feel like throwing it in. And I thought maybe I'm not a poet. Maybe I'll just open up a frame shop in town and pursue some other career. But so Miller Williams kind of bailed me out of that dark spot.
And it turned a corner, and it wasn't long before your work was earning high critical acclaim, and you had this broad, extremely broad for a poet in America, audience base, group of fans, readers. Have you ever stopped to think how that came about? I mean, why that is?
I think it would be dangerous to stop and think about that too long.
Okay.
I don't know. I'm happy to have it. It's what every poet or writer secretly wants. I mean, to write is, or not so secretly, to write is an act of hope, in that you're hoping someone will read you, and when that hope is fulfilled, it's very gratifying. I forget how many copies the University of Arkansas Press published or printed in 1986 or 8, I guess 8, maybe a couple thousand. Now that's a lot for poetry, and when that sold out, I was very happy. That's poets have fairly modest investments or hopes for their future.
The book is called The Apple That Astonished Paris, which we said at the top of the show, but I should have had you do this very first thing. I want you to read, and you've graciously agreed to read a poem called Introduction to Poetry for us.
Well, this was written some time ago, but it did become a kind of anthem after I became poet laureate, just to jump ahead from this despairing 40-year-old unpublished poet to the United States Poet Laureate a few seconds later. I did have this program to get poetry into high schools, and I was trying to get students to listen to clear contemporary poems without getting a kind of headache about how to respond to them. And the poetry program was called Poetry 180, and it was meant as a kind of balance to this overemphasis on analysis. And this poem, which I wrote innocently enough way before that, became a kind of anthem. It's about teaching poetry, and it's called Introduction to Poetry. And I refer to my students in the first line. I ask them to take a poem and hold it up to the light like a color slide, or press an ear against its hive. I say, drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe his way out, or walk inside the poem's room and feel the walls for a light switch. I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem, waving at the author's name on the shore, but all they want to do is tie the poem to a chair with rope and torture a confession out of it. They begin beating it with a hose to find out what it really means.
I love that poem because it doesn't really apply to me because I'm so lazy. I don't look for deeper meaning. I try to enjoy the sensuality of the words and the images and things like that. But I guess that's what you're telling me.
Well, but if you were in a high school class, you might be.
You feel compelled. Why do people feel compelled to look for hidden meanings and deeper?
I think teachers tend to teach poems that require their intervention. Otherwise, they wouldn't have a job. So if teachers presented completely self-explanatory poems that delivered their pleasures on the first bounce, then school would be out early.
Teacher out of a job.
Yeah, that's a simplification, but that's one reason, I think.
And you said that sort of became the guiding thesis for this 180, Poetry 180. 180 means 180 days a year, which is how many days there are in a school year, right?
Yeah, roughly 180 days. And it also implied this sort of turning back to poetry, of making a U-turn to come back to poetry.
How much work do you have to put in on what you consider to be a good poem? How much rewriting and paring down is there involved in that?
Poetry is not very labor-intensive, at least the way I write it. I mean, Max Beerbaum, the American humorist, said that the ant sets an example for us all, but it is not a good one. So I don't, and he also said that the hardest thing about being a poet was to figure out what to do with the other 23 and a half hours of the day. Yeah. So I tend to write my poems straight through, and then the revision takes place later, but the revision is never conceptual, or I'm not messing with the fabric of the poem. I'm making metrical changes in the music, and straightening out lines, and making the reader's passage through the poem more pleasurable. But the conceptual part is usually done in one sitting.
All right. Again, the name of the book is The Apple That Astonished Paris, your first published book of poems. Billy Collins is our guest here, who's the former Poet Laureate of the United States, 2 terms as a Poet Laureate of the United States. And as I read this book, there are several poems where you sort of place yourself in an abstract concept, like the blue as in out of the blue, or the vanishing point like you'd see in a picture or something. Why do you do that?
Well, I think I'm just prone, or I think poetry is prone, or gives you the freedom to make imaginative voyages or journeys. So many of these poems start in a kind of regular setting, but then they slip down some kind of rabbit hole into some area of speculation, where in the Vanishing Point poem, I actually travel out to the vanishing point. I get there, and then I look back, and I look at everything from coming toward me. So it's flipping perspectives like that poetry does offer, of all kinds of writing, the most imaginative freedom possible. And I like poems that try to take advantage of that.
You're doing a poetry reading tonight as we tape this program at the University of Arkansas. Do you like reading poems? Do you like reading your poems?
I do, yeah. I mean, it's a way of getting the work out, and it does add a kind of theatrical element to it. I think people, I enjoy it, but I think the audience enjoys not just the poet reading, but they enjoy being together with like-minded people. Writing poetry is a very solo activity, and I think generally people read poetry in silence, in privacy. And when in a poetry reading, you have maybe dozens or hundreds of people coming out of their privacy into a communal space. And I think there's a kind of a pleasure, an unstated pleasure, of being with like-minded people.
You're going to deliver one more thing for us. You'd agreed to read one more poem for us if you're still
Easily,
agreeable.
Of course,
I'd love for you to
of
do
course.
that. Yeah.
Well, this is another poem from The Apple That Astonished Paris, which I still think is my best title. I like The Apple That Astonished Paris. It's called Another Reason Why I Don't Keep a Gun in the House. The neighbor's dog will not stop barking. He is barking the same high rhythmic bark that he barks every time they leave the house. They must switch him on their way out. The neighbor's dog will not stop barking. I close all the windows in the house and put on a Beethoven symphony full blast, but I can still hear him muffled under the music, barking, 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 and now I can see him sitting in the orchestra, his head raised confidently as if Beethoven had included a part for Barking Dog. When the record finally ends, he is still barking, sitting there in the oboe section, barking, his eyes fixed on the conductor, who is entreating him with his baton, while the other musicians listen in respectful silence to the famous Barking Dog solo, that endless coda that first established Beethoven as an innovative genius.
Thank you for that poem and for this book of poems, all the books of poems, and thanks for making it to Arkansas. Billy Collins, appreciate it.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Okay, we're back with our panel of readers to talk about The Apple That Astonished Paris and Billy Collins' work in general. I want to introduce our panel to you. First, Joe McDougall. Joe is a poet, native of the Arkansas Delta, and you've authored 5 books of poetry. Or is it 6 now? It's 5?
No, it's 5.
It's 5. Stuck on 5. Okay.
Yeah.
Dirt, one of which was featured on this show.
Yes, it was.
Not too long ago. And the latest is called Satisfied with Havoc. Mm-hmm. And one of your works, Towns Facing Railroads, was just adapted to the stage and performed by the Arkansas Repertory Theater. So congratulations on that.
Thank you.
Glad to have you here. Numerous awards and literary prizes for Joe. Melissa King is an author whose memoir about basketball, called She's Got Next, has received a lot of critical acclaim as well. So congratulations on that. And
Thank
so
you.
glad you could join us here today. Melissa's work can also be seen in Sports Illustrated, Chicago Reader, and Sport Literate Magazine. And Hank Kaminsky is with us on our panel today. Hank is a sculptor who grew up in New York City and migrated to the Ozarks back in 1970. And one of his latest and greatest, his most recent works, can be seen up on the town square in the town center. And it's called the World Peace Prayer Fountain. Did I get that right? It's got some language on it too. So there's sort of
quite a few words.
Yeah, a lot of words. So words is what we're talking about today. And Billy Collins. Billy Collins, one of the most popular poets probably ever in American history. And former, of course, Poet Laureate of the United States. How familiar are you all with his work? I'll start with you, Melissa. Before we ask you to come on this panel, how familiar with his work were you?
Not terribly, actually. It's been a very nice discovery to be able to read his work and get familiar with it preparing for this. So
Joe,
I'm a newcomer.
You'd seen some of it before.
Yes,
right?
I had, but I did not know all the books. And so that's been a joy to try to find most of the books and look at those. But I remember the poems from journals. I subscribed way too many journals, and I remember seeing his work in poetry and being blown away by it. And then his wonderful introduction to poetry poem that's in The Apple That Astonished Paris is ideal for teachers to break the ice about poetry, to teach to students. So I used to use that when I was teaching.
Yeah. Now, how is it useful to a teacher? Because Billy said in some ways that some teachers felt stymied by that because it sort of inhibited them from, they thought, from going deeper into a poem.
Because students are scared to death of poetry, and you have to get down on their level of what they might understand. And here's a poet telling them not to do what the teacher usually tells you, which is to analyze the poem. What does it mean? And students hate that because they often don't know.
Hank, had you read Billy Collins before we got the book to you?
No, I actually bought a book, but it got lost on the shelf. I don't remember reading it until I opened this book.
I think we've all got a book like that we bought with good intentions and still haven't gotten back to yet. How would you describe his style, Melissa?
I think his style is accessible, but also very insightful. I appreciated several poems where there were sort of moments of recognition, kind of, I like to think of them as aha moments. Where you think, yes, I've experienced that before, or I know exactly what he's talking about right here. And I came away with that and really appreciated that about his poems.
A lot of us like poems that take everyday things and experiences and make them seem more meaningful, just by with the sort of clever use of language. I find a lot of that in Billy Collins' work. Do you, Joe?
Absolutely. Yeah. And this word accessible is quite true. But I think we have to be careful about the word accessible, because poets, for poets, that's just fraught with peril. Because a critic might say Billy Collins is accessible, and he might really mean Billy Collins is the work is very simple. Or he might say about a Joe McDougall poem, it's very simple and it's not very interesting. So in this wonderful interview in New Letters in 2004, there's a great interview with Billy Collins, and he talks about accessibility, and he says it's really just to open the door and let the reader in. And then, once you've got him in, you lead him on all kinds of journeys that would please any critic, but please the reader too. And I think that word is very misunderstood in poetry.
Isn't it a credit to his skill that he's able to give the appearance of such simplicity and such accessibility and yet not compromise, do those things that...
And it's not simple. There's great, the craftsmanship in these poems. The line breaks are perfect. The words, the language, the images.
You describe it in such a different way than I would describe it.
How
I mean,
would
the
you
way you
describe
describe it is so, from a poet's point of view, a technical question. I just love the spaces that he paints. I like the fact that he puts me into a space that I can actually imagine being in. His descriptions are so accurate that I can feel the edges of the spaces.
Yeah.
Melissa, are things left wanting for you in these poems? Or are they satisfying at the end of the poem to you in general and specifically?
No, it's not left wanting. I find them really satisfying. And but, you know, I think in any kind of writing, if you can get somehow back to the place you started, that's always very good. I heard a fiction writer say recently that you need to tell the story of your story in the first line of your first paragraph. I think he does that. He doesn't start out and not get back to where he started. There's a wholeness to it that I think is very effective.
A lot of his stuff seems to be built on fantasies that any of us might have, you know, like having snowflakes blow by us or being on a railroad track and watching everything converge like that. And then he just he has this great ability to get into them and have so much fun with it. That looks like that would be hard to do, to carry a reader on and make it as much fun for the reader. And you've had to do that. You've had to carry the readers on with your exploits in your memoir. And I know it's not easy, right?
No, it's not easy. I guess any writer or any artist trying to communicate has to think about where his reader is and what the reader will get. And you're trying to communicate maybe the intangible, but on the other hand, it has to be readable as well. And I think he strikes a really good balance between between those two things.
I want to ask each of you this, and I'll start with you, Melissa. When you're writing, are you imagining a person, a set of people, or do you think of your audience? Who are you talking to when you write?
Maybe not, you know, to a particular person or anything, but I sort of, in general, think of the disenfranchised. I think is who I try to write to. Really? Maybe I try to point out things about society or human nature that maybe get on my nerves, and someone else may have one of those aha moments and think, I'm so glad somebody said that, you know, or why didn't I say that? That's what I try to do.
You're writing for someone who might recognize these things.
I try to, yes.
How about you, Joe? Who are you thinking of?
When I first write the poem, when it first comes to me, I don't think about anything but the poem. Then in my revisions, I think a lot about who will be reading this. And maybe I have a word in there that I don't need such a big word. I could use I could use a smaller word, a lesser word, a more, not a Latinate word, and pare it down and make it something that would intrigue the reader. And so, yes, I am thinking.
You have an audience. You have specific audience.
I have that in my mind.
Hey?
I don't write to or sculpt to a specific audience. I just have a hard enough time getting out of that world that's so complex, the kind of environment that I'm looking to communicate in my sculpture. But I don't know. It's a very interesting question, because I never really had to address what level that I came to my audience at.
Yeah. And maybe each project is different. I mean, who knows? Yeah.
Well, yeah, sure. Some pieces are going to definitely be less accessible, but a piece that's in the public space has got to be accessible on some level. Yeah. But I really don't want to write down or talk down to my audience, so I try to give as big a concept as I can.
Yeah. We're talking about the book, The Apple That Astonished Paris, and other works by Billy Collins, a former poet laureate of the United States, who has a connection to our state in that the University of Arkansas Press published this, which was his first collection, big published collection of poems. And as you looked at these poems, we'll just take it around the horn here, which ones really struck you in this collection, Melissa?
I like, there's one called Winter Syntax that I really liked. Should I read a little bit of it, possibly? Yeah, okay.
That'd be great.
A sentence starts out like a lone traveler heading into a blizzard at midnight, tilting into the wind, one arm shielding his face, the tails of his thin coat flapping behind him. There are easier ways of making sense. The connoisseurship of gesture, for example. You hold a girl's face in your hands like a vase. You lift a gun from the glove compartment and toss it out the window into the desert heat. These cool moments are blazing with silence. The full moon makes sense. When a cloud crosses it, it becomes as eloquent as a bicycle leaning outside a drugstore, or a dog who sleeps all afternoon in a corner of the couch. Bare branches in winter are a form of writing. The unclothed body is autobiography. Every lake is a vowel, every island a noun.
What'd you like so much about that?
The imagery is just beautiful. The full moon, cloud passing over a full moon. I can see that so plainly. But again, it gets back to I guess you'd call it theme, where we're talking about a sentence in the first paragraph, and we get back to the idea of the limitations of language. And so he plays by the rules, I suspect, that are in poetry, and that one just really stood out to me as nice in so many different ways.
Great.
Well, and you mentioned earlier that he always goes back to what he started with, and he does that in this poem, doesn't he?
Yes, he does.
He refers right back to vowels and nouns that make up sentences.
Exactly.
Which one have you got, Hank?
This is called Vanishing Point.
It's the first one in the book.
It's the first one in the book.
Yeah.
And it has a little prologue with an apple, I want to astonish Paris. Paul Cézanne. You thought it was just a pencil dot art students made in the middle of the canvas before they started painting the barn, crows, haystacks. Or just a point where railroad tracks fuse, a spot engineers stare at from the cabs of trains as they clack through the heat of prairies heading out of the dimensional. But here I am at the vanishing point, looking back at everything as it zooms toward me. Barns, cows, tracks, haystacks, farmers, the works, shrinking and disappearing into this iota, as if pulled by a gravity that is horizontal. I am a catcher behind the home plate of the world, a scientist observing a little leak in reality. I watch the history of architecture narrow down to nothing, all straight lines rushing away from themselves like men who have caught on fire. Every monument since Phidias converges in this speck. Imagine a period that could swallow all the sentences in an encyclopedia.
That's got to be a real visual artist pleasing poem right there.
Space, let me tell you, that's an amazing space he creates.
Yeah.
And it's not just an intellectual exercise, it's an exercise in descriptive language, descriptive images.
Sure takes you there, that's for sure. Okay, Joe, one more from you. All right.
I'd like to read Passengers out of the new and selected poems. Actually, this poem is from the book Picnic Lightning, which established Billy Collins in a very large way in the poetic and the larger world. I like this poem because it's typical Billy Collins in that there's a human voice in a certain place. So we know where we are and we identify with this voice. Then there are surprises in the language and surprises in the imagery, and it's very conversational. At the gate, I sit in a row of blue seats with the possible company of my death. This sprawling miscellany of people, carry-on bags and paperbacks that could be gathered in a flash into a band of pilgrims on the last open road. Not that I think if our plane crumpled into a mountain, we would all ascend together, holding hands like a ring of skydivers into a sudden gasp of brightness, or that there would be some common spot for us to reunite, to jubilize the moment. It's just that the way that man has his briefcase so carefully arranged, the way that girl is cooling her tea, and the flow of the comb that woman passes through her daughter's hair. And when you consider the altitude, the secret parts of the engines, and all the hard water in the deep canyons below, well, I just think it would be good if one of us maybe stood up and said a few words, or so as not to involve the police, at least quietly wrote something down.
That's great. Love that.
I eliminated a few lines for those who know this poem by heart.
Okay.
To make it a bit shorter.
Okay. Well, that's great.
Yeah,
Thank you all. Hey, so much. Thanks so much for coming here. Joe McDougall, Melissa King, and of course, Hank Kaminsky. Thanks for reading the book, and thanks for sharing with us.
Thank you.
All right. The book again, The Apple That Astonished Paris. It has a connection to Arkansas. It's by Billy Collins, former poet laureate of the United States, and it was first published by the University of Arkansas Press. And also thanks to everyone here at Nightbird Books. Thanks for joining us on the Same Page. Lisa Sharp is the proprietor here at Nightbird Books in Fayetteville, new bookstore. There's the Nightbird right there. It's a she, right?
Yes, it's a she.
Where did the Nightbird come from?
Well, she's painted by a local artist, Dea Self, who was actually voted Fayetteville's favorite artist last year. And my husband bought this for me a few years ago as a Christmas present. And I wanted an unusual name that would catch.
It's really kind of neat. Now, can the Nightbirds come in here? How late are you going to be open?
We're going to be open until 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock Friday and Saturday.
All right. A bookstore kind of has to do that in this day and age,
Yes.
right? A lot of people come out and shop for books after work and at night as a sort of a destination anymore, bookstores. And this is going to be kind of the independent bookstore.
That's right. Close to downtown Fayetteville, we wanted to be part of the nightlife.
Yeah.